with the City Council Ordinance Committee. Thank you to everybody who's here, both those on the commission and council and those who are the other participants in this. Appreciate everybody being here. First item on the agenda is the agenda. Any changes to it? Okay, then we have our agenda as it stands. Item 2 is a public forum, and we ask that this public forum be for items that are not on the agenda, and the main item on the agenda tonight is the short-term rentals. And just as a reminder, for the reason that we're doing it this way is at our last meeting, when we were dealing with short-term rentals, we spent a lot of time at the beginning of the meeting hearing the public comments on the short-term rentals. And we went to the commission discussion on it. And we were in the middle of the commission discussion when we ran out of time for the evening. And we decided that we would continue with the commission discussion at this meeting. And then after we're done with our commission discussion on it, we'd go back to the public forum. And so people from the public could respond to the work that we've been doing and make comments to, what our proposals are, anything that we've been doing, rather than interrupting us while we're still in the middle of our discussion. So with that, Megan, do you know if there's any members of the public that would like to speak on items not on our agenda?
So far, I have not heard from anybody that wants to speak on an item not on the agenda. So for those of you that are here attending the meeting, if you would like to speak on something that is unrelated to short-term rentals, please either use the raise hand feature or put a quick note in the chat. If you're joining on a phone, you can raise your hand using *9. Andy, I did have one person contact me ahead of the meeting that they can only stay until 7:30. If you would be willing to entertain their comments now. They do want to talk about short-term rentals, but they can't stay for the whole meeting.
Sure, that'd be fine. And then we'll take that one, but then we'll move into our commission discussion after that.
Okay. 1 second, I'm looking for, oh, here we go. Erica Reddick. You should be able to unmute yourself.
Hello, thank you, Megan, and thank you, Council Committee, for taking my comments early. That's greatly appreciated. I have been keeping up with what has been going on and tracking the chatter and the conversation. And I just have to say that while I really appreciate all the work that the landlords, other landlords have been doing and short-term rental folks have been doing, I had to just speak up and say that, frankly, in my opinion, any sort of, any sort of, I guess, I can't think of the right word, but just going along and kind of trying to find a compromise with the committee, I think is a mistake. And so I would really like, I know this isn't a question and answer time, but I would really like everyone on the committee to take a moment to ask themselves why they believe they have the right to tell any homeowner what they are and are not allowed to do with their property. I would like for all of you to ask yourselves why you believe you have the right to tell me as a homeowner how I can or cannot make money. I find it deeply, deeply troubling that the city of Burlington, the committees, the city council, the attorneys, etc., believe that they have more right to my property than I do. That you as a council, as a committee, as attorneys, etc., zoning commissioners and all of that kind of stuff can behave in such a way so as to make it so that Burlington is so expensive and that the taxes are so high that homeowners believe or feel like they have to convert some of their rooms to short-term rentals to be able to survive and stay in Burlington. I really am curious why you believe that you can continue to make decisions where it is so exorbitantly expensive to live there that we then have to do things to try to make up for it and survive. You know, I've heard repeatedly folks talking about like something like 60% or more of the people who do short-term rentals are women, single women over the age of 60 who are trying to age in place to stay in their homes and take care of themselves and keep the asset, that home that they worked so hard for, that you believe you have the right to take that away from them, I think is deeply troubling. And I really hope that all of you will look internally, especially because some of the people on this council are very wealthy and don't have the same issues. Why do you believe that you know better than the people who have worked tremendously hard for decades for those assets that they have? And you're trying to make rules for the exception. You know, the exception is some rich guy comes and buys up a house and converts it. Well, again, you know, that's their right to do that. It's really not your right to say that it's not, because the reality is everyone has to work very hard for what they have. And yes, it's true that there are some people who are less fortunate than others, and they don't have as much of an ability to be homeowners and to be able to afford to live in Burlington. But it really—
I don't mean to cut you off, but if you could wrap up, because I do want to get to commission discussion.
Got it. I assumed there was a timer or something like that.
No,
So
there's
thank you
not.
for letting me
Sorry.
know. But I really, especially the wealthy people on this committee, especially the people who are living off of trust funds and have not had to work for what they have, I really want you to look deep inside yourself and ask why you believe you have the right to tell us what we are and are not allowed to do with our property. So thank you for that. I very much appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. And with that, unless Megan, there's anybody else who wants to speak on non-short-term rental items.
I didn't see anyone, Andy.
Okay, then we'll move on to item 3, which is the proposed CDO amendment for short-term rentals. And again, after the commission discussion, we'll be going to get public input on this, but we want to finish our commission discussion. Just to recap from where we left off last time, there were several issues in front of us last time that we dealt with. The first one was whether we were, in having consensus to split the short-term rental issue between zoning and the minimum housing codes. And we agreed as a group that it would be some in the zoning and the remaining in minimum housing code. And then we looked at the zoning provisions and were satisfied, I think with a few exceptions that were then dealt with by staff, we're satisfied with the zoning code, the proposed zoning amendments. And then we turned to the housing code, the minimum housing code. And our focus when we were doing minimum housing code, and it's in our packet, it's primarily the chart that we were looking at, which is, what page is the chart on? That
Page
outlines
16 of your packet.
16. On page 16 of our packet, that goes through the different scenarios of when people can have short-term rental in their properties and under what circumstances. And those are all by rule as opposed to by the zoning code. And we've gotten through some of that. And I know Megan and Scott were going back and taking a look at some of the things we did or were asking for. And I think you made some updates to this. So if the two of you want to update us with the changes that you made, that's in our packet, then we could go back as the group to look at that chart on page 16 and hopefully get through our discussion on that one. And then we could turn to any other provisions in the minimum housing code that might be relevant to it. Then after we were done with that, we were going to step back and look to see if there were any exceptions that needed to be made to any of this. And that wasn't certain yet, but we wanted to get through the general rule first before we looked at any exceptions. So that, Megan and David, any updates for us?
Andy, I see Counselor Mason has his hand up. I don't know if he has a
Sure.
question before we get started. Okay, just wanted to make sure. Scott, did you want to jump in with the updates on what we did, well, you did to chapter 18 language?
Sure. I'll do a quick overview of what's different from the last time, because it's not too terribly different. So the definition has been revised a bit to reflect the state's, I'll say, relatively recent 14-day minimum for what constitutes an STR. So we're consistent with statute. Always a good idea. More significantly, the STR table in chapter 18 has been revamped. And basically the categories now are predicated on host residency. So as part of that, we've made clear, as was decided the last time, that if the host is short-term renting their own dwelling unit, that's fine in any scenario. The other two categories pertain to if the host is on the property, but not in that dwelling unit, and then the host being entirely offsite. So that's been the restructuring for that table. So fast forward to the two remaining points, two by my count anyhow. We still need to nail down what we want to do about host residency, offsite versus onsite. As presently drafted, it's still allowed in that table in 18 for multifamily properties with 3 or 4 units. And that ties into the second remaining point, and that is, do we allow short-term rentals at all in units, in buildings of 5 units or more? And I should clarify, that doesn't pertain to the host's own dwelling unit, right? We're basically talking about the host living either offsite entirely or not in that dwelling unit. So last 2 points are, what are we doing about host residency, and 5-unit buildings or bigger? Do we allow it or not?
And Scott, by host residency, you mean for the smaller unit, the one, the single and duplex, or do you mean other ones as well?
Well, that's something we need to nail down.
Okay.
Right now, as presently drafted, it's only allowed for 3 or 4 unit buildings.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Yep.
Anything else, Megan or Scott, before we come to the commission?
Just one quick note to expand on something that Scott had mentioned about the 14 days as part of the definition. At the last joint committee, several of you were asking about our previous regulations that, or draft, that had allowed people to take advantage of the temporary provision in our zoning ordinance, which would say if they were using their home as a short-term rental for less than 30 days out of an entire year, they were exempt from getting a zoning permit. And there was a question about whether or not that would be applicable in chapter 18. So one of the things that staff did clarify is that the state law actually defines a short-term rental as something that's rented for more than 14 days out of the year. So that's the definition that Scott was talking about, reflecting how short-term rentals are defined in the statute already. So that would extend that exemption if there are fewer than 14 nights rented a year. The requirements for life safety essentially wouldn't apply to short-term rentals.
Okay, great, thank you. Emily, I think you had your hand up.
Actually, Megan answered my question. It was regarding the 14 days.
Okay. Any questions, comments from the commission or council? So we have our chart in front of us. Chip?
I guess, and I'm not sure when this was going to be addressed. I know I had asked if maybe Megan or Scott or David could sort of discuss, we're seeing some news articles, about efforts that are being done on a statewide level and sort of how those intersect with the conversations we're having. And then I know, based on a communication that we received today asserting some issues, I wanted to sort of check in with the city attorney's office about, ensuring that before we delve into this conversation of whether on-site, host is required, whether that is, passes muster with the city attorney's office, because I don't want to spend 5 hours coming up with a solution that doesn't work. So I'm not sure if now's the right time, but I want to just raise those questions.
it is a good time, but could you, I'm not sure I understand your question.
So I can speak to both of the questions, Counselor Mason, if you'd like.
Yes.
Okay.
Megan, could you just clarify what the question was to make sure we're all on the same page of that?
Yes, of course. So Counselor Mason had asked us to speak to, there was some news in the Free Press about a bill that had been introduced in the legislature, H200, that is proposing a statewide registration process and includes a definition of a short-term rental that requires the property to be the host primary residence for at least 9 months of the year. So we have been watching that bill. It was first introduced at the beginning of February, and so far we know that one of the sponsors of the bill introduced it in one of the House committees. But as far as we're aware, there's no other action that's been taken on that bill and no other actions that have been scheduled on that bill. So it's really unclear to us at this point if that bill has any momentum. We are at a staff level, we're kind of anticipating that it may not make it through the entire legislative process this session, if at all. But we will continue to keep an eye on it. So from a staff perspective, we think it makes sense for us to continue to move forward with our conversations until or unless we know something different about that bill. The other question that we received today was just a question about the communication that you received from the BTV Host Coalition about the idea that they would consider their options around legal proceedings related to the residency requirement if the committee were to include it in our restrictions. And there was a question about whether or not we know that a residency requirement is a legal tool for us to use in regulating short-term rentals. So, Scott and I in previous research have looked into, what other communities have experienced in terms of lawsuits related to regulating short-term rentals. And based on our research, we understand that regulating residency in some form is a very common tool associated with short-term rental regulations. And we have not found examples of lawsuits that have revoked those restrictions based on regulatory takings arguments. There are lots of other kind of issues out there that lawsuits related to other kind of constitutional questions, but not specifically related to residency and takings.
Okay,
Thank you. That was very helpful.
okay. Kim?
And
Did you have-
just, Counselor Mason, I saw your question earlier, and our office has not taken a deeper dive into that, but if certainly we can.
Okay. Well, Megan, Scott, thanks for preparing all of this. I just want to, I'll start off by saying, I think we've made a lot of progress on this chart. And for myself, I'm mostly satisfied with it, but it's actually interesting on the exact issue we just talking about, the residency requirement. I do still have concerns about the residency requirement as we have it here for like the single family, the single detached and the duplex. I know we've been all over on this one trying to sort this out, and we've been trying to figure out whether grandfathering is an option, because one of the concerns we've heard from a number of people who've been coming to us is that they have been renting out. It may not be their primary residence. It may be, for one person who's spoken to us, it's a house that's been in the family for years, but she lives in a different house and they've been using it for a short-term rental, and others perhaps in a duplex that may not live on site, but still want the option of being able to, at times, have it be used as a short-term rental. And when we were doing this all under zoning, that was a real challenge for us, because if we were to allow them at all under zoning, then it's almost a forever thing. You do it once and it's allowed forever, and you're never really able to go back on that. Once we put it into minimum housing code, I think the beauty of that is it gives us a lot of flexibility to try, to see what impact it would have, because frankly, We don't know what impact some of these things will have. And I've been looking at this one of how do we sort of thread that needle of accommodating the people who may not live on site, but want the ability. And one of the things that to do the short-term rental. And one of the things we don't want to do is to encourage people or support people to buy a single family dwelling or a duplex for the purpose of turning it into a short-term rental. And I've been looking at this, and for me, we've not come up with a better solution. And the one that's remaining for me is to put a time frame on it. So for example, if somebody has had a single family house or a duplex for more than, say, 3 years, that they can have it be one of the units there be used as a short-term rental. In that sense, people won't buy a house today so that in 3 years from now they could turn it into a short-term rental. But it's for somebody who's had a house for a while, who may not be living there anymore, but wants the ability to do that, for whatever reason, whether it's financial reasons or because they want the flexibility that some parts of the year they may want family members to be there. Other parts of the year, they don't need anybody to be there for whatever the reason. But to give that flexibility, and then we could see over time, because you have to do the registration, we could see how many people are signing up for this. I think it could be a simple process to put in place on the short-term rental registration. Just ask the question: have you owned it for more than 3 years? If it's yes, and there's no one disputes it, we could just go forward with it. And we get the information from those rental registrations over the course of time and see, are too many people signing up for it? Are not enough? If too many people are doing that and it looks suspicious, or just too many people more than what we want, because it's under regulations and not under zoning, we could pull back on it if we need to. But it gives us the information that we need. And I think this is one of the sticking points that we've heard lots of comments from people in the public who've been coming and speaking with us. This is probably one of their biggest concerns, that they lose that flexibility to be able to do this. We've also heard that the single families and the duplexes hardly have an impact on the rental in Burlington. Most of that comes from the larger units. So having this ability may or may not have much of an impact on our rental stock in the city. But doing this process will give us that information that we need. And in a year or two, we could revisit it and see, did it take too much away from the rental stock? Did it have a big impact? And if it did, as I said, that's the beauty of putting it in the code, in the minimum housing code. We could always fix it later. If it was in zoning, you really can't go back and fix it. But under minimum housing code, you can. And so I would rather, from the get-go, be a little bit more flexible on this one to see what impact, rather than being more stringent. And then we really won't know whether it could work one way or another, but allow it to happen and see what happens. And then we can always fix it later. So that to me is one of the few things that's left in this chart that we have to address. And I think this is one way of doing it. There may be others, but no one has figured that other way out yet. So this is a proposal that I'm putting out there. Comments, questions, thoughts? Jennifer?
So just to clarify, you're suggesting a time limit for any number of units? So like it would be across the board for all of them, or just for the single family and the duplex?
Well, it's already said in the chart that for more than 5 units, you don't have STRs unless it's your own dwelling unit. And you could do an STR in your own dwelling unit that you're living in. For 3 or 4, the chart already shows that the host could live off site. So I'm only talking here about the single detached dwelling and the duplexes. And the concern with the single family and the duplexes is we don't want to, as I said, we don't want to open the door for people to just buy them for the purpose of turning them into a short-term rental. On the other hand, if they've already had it for a few years, I think we could be flexible with them.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really interesting idea and solution to address some of the people that have been longtime owners of the properties and are seeing an additional use for it. So appreciate that idea. I'm interested in what others think, but I do think that's a interesting way to get around sort of that speculative, just buy the house and turn it into a short-term rental. approach because you got to sit on it for 3 years in order to do that. So that's an interesting approach. So appreciate that. But I also think we've got to like get to the other ones. I think I also want to open the discussion or have the discussion about how we treat those larger units too.
The ones larger than 5 units, 5 or larger, or other units?
The 3 to 4 and 5 and over. So yeah.
Okay. Bruce?
I'd just like to say, Andy, I like what you're proposing because I think it addresses the issue of the folks we don't want to hurt that are trying to live in their homes and pay their mortgages, yet we're not impacting the housing supply, and we can adjust it later. And also, I think there's another concern that a couple of others have raised is we don't want the neighborhoods turning into sort of party houses or whatever with short-term rentals. So I think this allows that control that you wouldn't have in zoning, and it's the primary benefit of it. But if we could age it in like that, allow for 3 years and then be qualified, I think that makes some sense.
Soraya?
Yeah, I first have a question, and sorry, this is taking us, I should have done this when Chip asked his question, but and I have meant to ask this question to Kim and Megan, but I've been on a little bit of a kick of how much we can tax things. And I realize that that's a conversation I should have had offline, but wondering how we can or cannot use gross receipts tax as an additional tax, or if that's something that's off the table until we do a charter change. If you know that, Kim, if not.
I can speak to the specifics. I think in these meetings, occasionally we've talked about rooms and meals taxes, and I think Kim may have done some research to clarify that it is actually gross receipts that already apply to short-term rentals. Kim, did you want to speak to that?
Yeah, we already receive the additional tax for that do apply. So it would be a charter change if you were to seek additional taxes for them.
Okay, and then the other thing is I'm not opposed to the approach of, well, the data that we have kind of shows this, and then let's see what the demand out there is. But I think it does worry me a little bit, just because once we see that once people have things, it's really hard to take it away again, because then there's so I'm a little bit worried about us allowing something and saying, oh, we can just take it away again in the future, because it's not that easy, because folks will come in and say, but I've done this now. I just hit the 3-year threshold and now I want to. So I'm a little worried about us just saying, oh, it's really easy to just give that permission again. And then another question, and this I think is for Megan, is I know that we have at least one circumstance where there's someone who has and I'm more just trying to understand where the situation fits in, where there's someone who doesn't have a unit. It's like a bedroom that has like a kitchenette, but it's not a unit because it's not a full kitchenette, and how that fits into this chart if they have kind of this like ADU that doesn't really qualify as a unit.
I think if the configuration actually truly doesn't meet the city's definition of a dwelling unit, we would probably consider it a room, and it would be regulated as a partial unit short-term rental. In all of the circumstances for partial units, so a room within a dwelling, there is a limit to the number of rooms that can be individually rented, and they all require that it's the host primary residence.
Okay. And yeah, then I guess the last thing is in all of these circumstances, or at least in the multi-unit ones, you could basically, I guess we could still have an offsite even if we took out that second column, where somebody can work with a tenant to have, because the tenant can be a host. The host can be a tenant, kind of, because it's just we decided to go with the host language, I guess is what I'm pointing out.
Right, the host could be a tenant.
Okay.
Anyone else? Are you all set, Soraya?
Yes.
Emily?
I would wonder how many people would actually, who we've heard from, would actually qualify for this because they have had it as an investment property before they started short-term renting it, and they've transitioned from renting out apartments to short-term renting. And then people who had single-family homes have been short-term renting it for maybe several years. And so I'm not sure that that would help them if they've already stopped living in it as their primary residence. I think it would only really help people who are currently living in it in their primary residence and will stop. We have a house in our neighborhood that is a single family home, was lived in by a family. They had 3 boys, walked to Edmonds, went to Burlington High School. Boys went to college. Parents moved to Colchester. Instead of selling their house, they short-term rented it, are renting it. It's a single family home, and they make $9,000 a month off of it. I don't think they're ever going to sell that house if they can continue to make $9,000 a month off of it. It is a problem. They do have parties there. One of my neighbors complains about it quite a bit, who lives right next door. I'm not sure that person would ever have an incentive to sell that house to another family or even rent it out to people who go to UVM and live there for a long period of time. I'll agree with Zariah that I think what we've learned is when you get accustomed to being able to do something, it's really hard to claw something back. And if we allow this, I think we're going to have more people enjoying making money off of their properties in this way, and it's going to be really hard to take that back. And I would add that maybe people would live in houses for 3 years, turn it to a short-term rental, buy another primary residence, live there for 3 years, turn it into a short-term rental. The money's really big. $9,000 a month is a lot. So I understand the desire to accommodate people who have spoken very passionately about their desire to be able to continue to do short-term rentals. But I have some hesitation about this.
Yeah, I'll just say, I'll come to you, Megan, in just one sec. You know, there are plenty of times where we've changed rules on people, and a short-term rental is different than other kinds of things where we've changed rules where things are more dramatic. In a short-term rental, it's a rental unit, and it's a rental unit that happens to be rented for a short term. So we're not telling people you can't rent it. We're not telling people you have to do much different other than you need to rent it now. You don't have to make any changes, but you just can't rent it for such a short term anymore. And it may have a big impact, but structurally, in terms of the property, they don't have to make any other changes other than the way that they advertise it and the way that they rent it. We're not telling them they have to go out and pull out a kitchen. We're not telling them they have to change walls around. So there's none of those big things that are one of the things that make it difficult to change zoning and make it difficult when people are doing something. This is strictly a way that they're using it, and they could fully use it as a regular long-term rental. And if as a city we're seeing too many of these short-term rentals from people that don't live there, I don't think it's going to be that hard to pull it back because of the impact it's going to have. And I mean, we could speculate a lot about what impact it will have, but we really don't know because we don't know how many people are going to sign up for it. And in terms of the impacts it has on neighborhoods, we have a lot of rules in place, and perhaps we need more to make sure that these don't have impacts. And if they do have impacts, then again, that's part of the flexibility of the rules that we have, is that if they start to have impacts, we could pull it back and we could restrict people. We could take their what are we calling it, the certification to be able to, the rental registration to be able to do this. If they're having the adverse impacts on the neighborhoods, we could pull that from them. So I think there are a lot, especially because we've put it in the rules. We have a lot of resources available to deal with problems like that. And I think that, I mean, again, in this kind of a situation, I think we could be a little bit more lenient now because we have a lot more rules that are and options that are available to us to deal with any problems that may come up, and to cut it back completely if that's a problem. Megan?
Andy, I just had a clarifying question for you about
Sure.
the idea that you proposed. Was it that somebody was just the owner of a property for a certain period of time, or would they have had to been the primary, would it had to have been their primary residence?
I think for me, it just keep it simple. It would just have to be the owner for at least 3 years.
Okay.
And if they've been renting it out for several years, that's fine. And we could just see again what the impact of that would be. I don't know that they have to have lived there for that amount of time, but they've been, at least for me, I'd just keep it simple at the outset and see what more restrictions, if any, we have to put into it.
Thank you. I just wanted to make sure I was following.
Anyone else? Jack?
Yeah, I would still, I would still think along the lines of what Zerai and Emily were saying, that taking the more restrictive approach to begin with, and this argument around, gathering data, I agree with, but that's not exclusive to the more permissive approach. If we don't allow offsite owners to Airbnb, we can still gather data on the on-site owners and how many of them Airbnb, which is still, I think we need to remember, that's still a loss of a rental unit, and that still has a negative impact on the rental housing market. When if someone owns a 4-unit building that they live in and they convert one of those units to an Airbnb, that's still a loss of a unit. But I think doing it that way, we can gather that data on how many of the owner occupied folks convert and then make a decision from there, versus starting with the more permissive approach in gathering the data. So I agree with the gather data and then decide, but I'd rather start safer as we do that. And then I guess my other comment about the time window, I mean, I think that could be helpful, but I don't know that it necessarily, really addresses the problem, because if someone has enough money to purchase property in Burlington, I mean, it's a pretty good investment, even if you can't Airbnb. And so you could purchase a property to long-term rent it as an investment, which obviously many people do that. And then 3 years down the road, you could convert and make even more money than you were through short-term renting. So I don't know that it sort of prevents that speculation, because it already makes financial sense to purchase an investment property and long-term rent it out. And so you can do that, and then 3 years later, switch it. Or I guess you're saying that anyone that's already owned for 3 years, so major landlords and things like that, they've owned the properties in many cases for more than 3 years, they could convert, for example.
Yeah, if they want to, and as I said, if it looks like too many are doing that, we change the rules, because these rules are flexible. That's my view of it. I mean, I appreciate the approach of trying to look at it and be more restrictive at the beginning. I just don't think that gives us the information that we need. I think by letting people do and seeing what impact it is, if we let people do, we could pull back. But if we don't let people do, we'll never know how many people would want to take this approach. That's my view of it. Jack, go ahead.
Well, yeah, that's what I don't really understand and kind of push back on, because even if we prevent the offsite, we still have anyone in the universe of owner occupied. We still get to gather that data and see how many of those folks are doing it. So I still feel like we are getting a broad sampling of data that we can learn from, because that still accounts for a large number of units and a large category of people that might be interested in doing Airbnb. Anyone that owns, anyone that lives in the building they own, whether that's 1 through 4 units.
Thanks. Let me go to Bruce and then back to you, Zariah.
Just a question, Andy, or maybe for Megan. Isn't it part of the logic behind Chapter 18 that we're trying to regulate the number of them? So you'd have a number of registrations, you know what they are, and anyone else who were not registered or didn't already have a zoning permit wouldn't be allowed to do it. So we'd know the number. And you could adjust that number from year to year, just like the number of liquor licenses you give out in a year and the number you decide not to.
The registration process would allow us to know how many we have that have actively been seeking the rental registration each year. But the proposal to move to Chapter 18 doesn't include a cap, for example. So I'm not sure if that's what you were meaning, Bruce.
Well, but you'd have the power to do it under Chapter 18.
I mean, if that is a way that the city wanted to regulate, staff has advised against setting an ultimate cap across the city. But yeah, it could be possible under Chapter 18 if that was an approach that the city wanted to take.
Anything else, Bruce? Let me come back to Zariah, and then Chip, I see you had your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, I think I am sympathetic to the thing of like getting data and seeing how big the problem is, but I feel like the moment when we're like, oh my gosh, this is so many more people than we thought, is also the moment that there's going to be a lot of pushback on us changing it. And the idea of, well, it won't be that hard because ultimately we're not taking anything from anyone. They can still long-term rent it. That's true today. Like we could exclude it now and they can still long-term rent it. So if we're saying it's not hard for us to do that in the future to more people, then it shouldn't be hard for us to do it today to fewer people. And so I'm not sure that that's true, because otherwise it wouldn't be that hard to do it today. I would be much more sympathetic, because I do understand like some people prefer to rent to people like traveling nurses. And so if we had an option of allowing it for 90 days, just so that it's in between some of the kind of medium term rentals, that's an option that I would choose. But this isn't what we're like, that it doesn't feel like that's an option to us. And so to allow to buildings that are replacing long-term housing is, I think that's a decision that we're making today that will be harder to make in the future when there are more people, because it's the same decision.
Thanks. Chip?
Thanks, Andy. I find I'm frustrated. I think we're all frustrated because the reality is that, or my assessment after 12 months of these conversations, our only hook for regulating is owner occupancy, and that if we go down that path, it has a very negative impact on a number of people with very real stories of how they got here. So, I mean, this is not thrown at anyone. I mean, I'm to blame too. I find it frustrating we are unable to come up with an alternative means by which to regulate them, because the fear of everyone, expressed or not, is that, by opening this spigot and creating a process, there's going to be, an overwhelming flood to move in this direction because there's more money to be had. And none of us know where the truth is, because we haven't allowed that process. I am more sympathetic, given where we are and what we have to do, to Andy's position than I think, that we're going to ban or we're going to require owner occ throughout. As to the concern, that people will think they have a vested right, they won't. I mean, the reality is, after they hire Bruce or some other lawyer, they're going to know that, guess what, even though your intention may be to short-term rental, make this available, that's not a vested right and can be changed on an annual basis. So if you think that's a good use of your money and you're paying a premium on the assurance or belief that you're going to be able to short-term rent that, guess what, that's a risk. And I somewhat feel the same. I appreciate we've had people show up and are very frustrated because they feel have a vested right now. The reality is they don't. I mean, we heard last week there have, the planning and zoning office or code enforcement has gone after people who don't have a registered, bed and breakfast, which is the only permitted use. So, I don't want to, I mean, while I appreciate there will be people who will show up and will be upset, I think, my vote is we have to do that in order to see, balance the competing policy goals, come forward with something with the expectation that some people are not going to be happy. And it also is subject to an annual review. That's the benefit of being in minimum housing as opposed to ordinance. So, thank you.
Thanks. Anyone else, especially ones we haven't heard from? Alex?
Andy, would you mind repeating your proposal?
Sure. It's pretty simple, just for single detached dwelling units and duplexes, that if the owner is not, or the host is not on site, that if they've owned the property for more than 3 years, they could short-term rental it and not live on site. And then we collect data, and we'll, through the rental registrations, we'll know how many get converted to short-term rentals and for how long. Because one of the things we've heard from a lot of people that do the short-term rentals in their homes is, in the smaller, in the duplexes and the single-family homes, is they go back and forth. Some parts of the year they do short-term rentals, some parts of the year they do long-term rental, and they just are looking for that flexibility to be able to do that. And so, if you've been in the house, if you've owned the property for more than 3 years, it gives you the flexibility to do that. And then over time, the city could collect the data to know what impact that is having one way or another and take corrective action if needed. Either way.
Thank you for repeating that, because I was basically ready to agree with the table as on that appears on page 16 of our packet. That looks pretty good. So thank you for introducing a wrinkle.
Well, it's, I think, to me overall, I think the chart, the table on that page is, I think we've gotten it to a pretty good place, and we still need to have further discussion on it, obviously. But the one issue that we haven't been able to nail down is the offsite, the person that doesn't live in the smaller unit house. And so trying to see if we could nail that down one way or another in today's discussion, because I think once we get this done, the rest is going to just be, we'll be able to finish it up pretty easily beyond that, because this is the one issue that keeps coming back to us time and time again. And I would assume, presume that during our public comments, this is going to be the issue that people will want to be addressing, as they have many times before. So it'll be good to come up with a definitive answer one way or another. Harris?
Yeah, I just want to ask Megan or Scott why staff is not recommending a cap, or some number, at some point even down the road, because it does seem to make sense to me. If we're worried about, this kind of being a trend that takes over, people buying houses or duplexes or whatever, and with the intent of turning them into short-term rentals, why wouldn't a cap be a partial solution to that?
Go ahead, Scott, if you.
I was just going to say, you've spoken to this before,
Oh,
Megan. You can speak again, and I can fill in any blanks if you leave any.
Okay. There are a couple of concerns that we have. I think the first is that with regulations, whether they're in zoning or minimum housing, it's most fair and most clear if someone knows what they can do on their own property as a standalone property. When we set caps, or if we say, you can only, if you own 5 properties across the city, you can only have this many short-term rentals across them. Any of those kind of standards are just more complicated for the city to enforce and for people to understand exactly what they're allowed to do on the property that they own. That's one concern. I think the other concern that we have is that the cap can create a kind of a rush for people to come in and try to get short-term rentals registered, and may actually kind of work against us in terms of them ever leaving the short-term rental kind of market and returning to long-term rentals, because we're creating a very valuable asset that is something that is limited and hard to get once the cap has been reached.
I'd also say that it's a very blunt instrument that wouldn't, it's very blunt and wouldn't distinguish in any way of the nuances that we're talking about here. It wouldn't encourage one type versus another. It would just be the folks who get in through the door first get it, period.
So all that said, from a regulatory perspective, I think is really important, but kind of from a policy perspective, if we developed some set of indicators that we wanted to track and follow to see how well are things working, the proportion of units that are being short-term rented versus long-term rented might be something we look at to see, is this continuing having an impact? Is it having greater an impact, a lesser an impact? And how do we adjust our policies going forward to accommodate that? That might be one way to incorporate something like that. But I reiterate what Scott and Megan said. From a regulatory perspective, putting in a cap like that creates this whole nother economic dynamic that would be very difficult to manage.
Harris, are you all set?
Yeah, thanks. That definitely adds a lot to the conversation, and does make a lot of sense. I still, am considering it in my mind, but that gives me a lot more information. Yeah.
Jennifer, did you have your hand raised?
I did. Just a clarification. So in terms of what you were saying, Megan and Scott, would that assume that there would be like a cap that would live with the property over time, that once they got it, they had it? Or would you look at an annual cap? So every year people would have to register until you got to a certain cap. So it wouldn't necessarily be the same people every time getting a short-term rental.
It would be an annual cap. The way this is set up now is an annual registration.
Yeah, that's actually a layer of complexity that I actually hadn't considered before, Jennifer, because when we talked about the cap in the past, we were talking about zoning, and that would be, over the life of the permit until that use has been extinguished.
Right.
The annual process to me, feels like it would be a big gamble for people
Right.
to know that you're always going to get it every year. That would be a big risk.
Yeah, so people wouldn't necessarily, I can see it. It's like, if you're trying to get a rental in a highly desirable place for the summer, for example, you get in queue early in the year so you could get that. And I could see that happening with short-term rentals. So people would know when that opens up, get your spot. And if you don't get your spot, you're out. And that would, to me, part of it is like, that would add some risk on the part of the owners, but would also reduce the longevity, I guess, of it going from year to year to year. And so with the added risk, it might seem less attractive to go that route, I guess, is what I'm saying. So it's not as attractive a proposition if you can't guarantee that you're going to have it every year.
Okay. Alex?
Yeah, isn't the other problem with the cap is that it eliminates the flexibility of people who, might have an extra whole unit and, use it as an in-law apartment for part of the year, or, rent it out for part of the year? There's a lot of issues with caps.
I think that was the point that Scott had added on, just about how the cap maybe wouldn't be sensitive to the different circumstances that we've tried to contemplate in structuring this table that we've talked about.
Yeah, for myself, I'd rather tighten regulations before putting on a cap. Do it that way. Soraya? Oh, you're on mute.
Just a quick question again to Megan and maybe Bill. I just want to check on the 3-year residency thing. I want to make sure, because I think we're all, the flexible use of sometimes long-term, sometimes short-term within a year is something that I think is almost a desirable use. And so is this 3-year qualification easy, like that much easier to regulate than, okay, if you're offsite, you're only allowed to do 90 days over the course of a year?
I think this is part of the reason why I asked Andy's clarifying question. So the way I understand Andy's proposal is that you just have to be the owner of the property for 3 years before you can start short-term renting. I don't think that it interfaces with how or when you could short-term rent beyond that. Am I right, Andy?
Yes, but it does give people still who own but don't live on site on the property the flexibility for example, during the school year to rent it out to longer term tenants and during the summer to rent it out on a short-term basis. Or other, other variations of it. Just gives the flexibility.
So I might be misunderstanding your question, Soraya.
Yeah, I guess I just want to make sure, because I think we've said in the past that like adding something like, for me, the ideal situation would be to say, if you're offsite, you can do 90 days a year. That way, if you are trying to do some kind of stopgap where maybe your family's coming this time of the year, but then sometimes of the year, like rather than saying, oh, if you're offsite, you can do short-term rental all year round, all of the time. I'm not that sympathetic to that situation. I am sympathetic to situations where somebody, it's not their main residence, but they are using it for some kind of, maybe their grandparent, or their parents come up every year in the summer, and then in the winter they short-term rent it. Those are the kind of things I think that we still want to allow, even in the 1 or 2. But I don't think that Andy's solution is really, to me, it's not getting at that solution. It's just saying, if you've owned the building long enough, you can do whatever you want, including renting it all year.
It would include that, but it goes beyond that. You're right.
Yeah. Andy's proposal doesn't specifically speak to that issue that you're talking about. So it doesn't change the previous responses that we've had just about like the difficulty with us enforcing a regulation that limits the number of nights rented per year.
But part of the, Soraya, part of the way I came up with this is I've been trying to also figure out the exact scenario that you're talking about, where somebody, it may be somebody's home, they may be there part of the year, it's not their primary resident, and so they wouldn't be allowed to short-term rent it. But it gives that flexibility so they could use it some year, not use it some of the year. But I couldn't figure that one out. I couldn't figure out how to put that into the regulations, and so this one was a blunter instrument, but that's partly of how I came up with this one. Bruce? Oh, and then Emily. Actually, let me go to Emily because I think you had your hand up before Bruce.
I understand what you're getting at, Andy, and I think I understand what you're getting at and what you want to accomplish. I'm just really concerned about this, and I don't understand why somebody owning a building for 3 years makes them a better person to Airbnb, or more worthy of that right, or more proven that they're going to be a good Airbnb host. I'm not sure why just successfully owning a building for 3 years entitles you to be able to do this. I have some leeway.
Can I just respond to that? It's not that you become a better person or you'd be a better host. It's the number of years of owning it before you could do this if you don't live on site is strictly so that people don't, out of the gate say, I'm going to go buy this house so I could turn it into an Airbnb today. I just think that if you're going to put some number of years, 3 years, 4 years, whatever the number is, that it's going to make it so people aren't going to buy a home for the purpose of turning it into an Airbnb. I could be wrong on that, but that's my sense, is that people don't think 3-4 years down the road for turning the property into something then. Because I don't want people to buy a house. It wouldn't be my idea for people to buy a home today, knowing that they could just flip it and turn it into a Airbnb kind of thing.
Well,
that's the reason I came up with the 3 years.
Right. Well, I think the other side of not wanting someone to buy a home for the sole purpose of doing this is somebody not selling a home for the sole purpose of doing this. It has the same net effect of taking a home that would have been transferred to someone else who was not going to Airbnb out of the market. So I think it's important to think about both sides of the transaction on that. And I hear what Soraya is saying, and I am intrigued, and I brought this up before earlier on, that I think allowing a longer number of days, like 90 days, 180 days, where you would be allowed to Airbnb under circumstances, that would allow a lot of flexibility for the type of situation that we're talking about. Somebody who it's their second home, someone who has family members come sometimes and use it, some of the stories that we've heard. And also, I think would actually have a net positive effect on the housing stock in Burlington, because I think that people would rent out their buildings and apartments for the school term. And then for the non-school term, where a lot of these student neighborhoods are empty, mine included, would short-term rent it during the summer, which is the most attractive and the highest demand for Airbnb. So I would look at something that would extend the number of days that we allow in order to accommodate more flexibility.
So just one thing, thanks for that, Emily. If folks also have comments, not just on the proposal I just put out there, but on the overall table on page 16, just if you're satisfied with the table as it is, beyond the issue I raised, but if you're satisfied with the table, let us know that as well, or if you have concerns with it and want any changes on there, so we could try and wrap up the table as well, just to broaden out the discussion. Jennifer.
So I really appreciate the input from Emily, particularly around the idea of there's two sides of the equation. So I definitely agree with the thought process, Andy, on the, you don't want people just coming in and buying properties that they're going to just immediately Airbnb. And so I think that's something that we've been seeing, and that's concerning. And so I really appreciate the idea behind it. But I do agree that if you have enough, you can make a lot of money from just buying another house and then Airbnb what you have. So appreciate that point of view too, Emily. So I kind of am like persuaded that we maybe need to go back to the original proposal, I think. I also think it'd be really hard to regulate the number of days. I don't know who would do that. Like who's gonna like actually track, oh, you're up to your 180 days, your 90 days, or whatever it is. I think that would be really challenging for the city to do. So even though it seems like a good solution, I just don't know how it would actually be implemented in practice. So I think, we've had a lot of discussion about the levers we have to try to prevent conversion of long-term rentals or long-term housing to short-term rentals. And getting back to this owner occupancy is like the one thing that is consistently, we know is a way to actually prevent that. So I think that maybe getting back to that original discussion might be good to sort of revisit like the decision we've already made in terms of the table. Because I just feel like we're going around and around, and there's some things that seem promising. Then we go down the rabbit hole. It's like, oh wait, there's this other, piece of things we have to consider. And it's like we really want to, put a stop on a lot of conversion. That I think the owner occupancy piece of it is a critical piece.
You have comments, and I'm going to start asking people as you're talking, comments on the overall table. Any other parts of it that you have questions, concerns, or are you satisfied with it? I want to go around. Is there anybody, let me ask this question. Is there anybody who has concerns or questions about the way the table is laid out, all the different variations of when you could do a short-term rental as laid out on the table, setting aside my proposal for a second? Just on the table itself, any concerns, any questions, any comments about it? And if not, I would take that, at least for now, that people are satisfied with it. Emily?
I do wonder, I think one thing that we've heard from people about is adjacent properties. Like, I don't see that on the table anywhere. And is that something we want something about or not? And like, could that be squeezed into the table? Like you have a lot that you've been using as a single lot and paying taxes as a single lot, but technically it's two. I mean, I would think that that's the equivalent. It functions much like an owner occupied situation. So do we want to entertain treating that as an owner occupied? And is it possible? And if Megan tells me it's not possible, then I say we move right on because I see the smile on her face.
Megan?
Scott or Kim or David can jump in on this one too. I think similar to the comment about the cap, when we're developing regulations, it's the most fair and straightforward way to structure a regulation that what you are doing on this piece of property is what you are allowed to do. We have talked before about, neighboring properties, and the particular situation I think that you're referring to that you've heard about a lot. I mean, there are all sorts of ways that we can create systems, but at some point we need to create something that is clear and straightforward for our regulations. So.
Okay. Anyone else have, Emily, are you all set? Right. You're on mute, but it looked like the answer is yes. Anybody else have concerns or questions about the table on page 16? So do I take it that we are satisfied with 16? Right. In that case, any other of the regulations in the minimum housing code that people have concerns or questions about? I'm not seeing any, then we're almost done with this. I think we're done then. Let me go back to my proposal then. It doesn't sound like, I mean, I like the idea. I think I heard some others that may have liked the idea, but I don't hear that it would be something that the collective group wants to do. Am I missing that?
Annie, I just want to say, I think that we were really trying to mine a variety of solutions that could meet the needs of people that we've heard from a lot. And I think a lot of us are sympathetic to trying to figure out a way to accommodate some of the different wrinkles of how people are offering this. And some of the stories are really compelling. So I just want to acknowledge that, at least from my perspective, I've heard that and I really have struggled. And I think we all have, trying to figure out ways where we can, create a clear policy that is, trying to get a handle on a large scale conversion potentially of permanent housing to short-term rentals, while also acknowledging that there's some very specific situations that are gonna be harmed by this potentially. And I feel that's just a real struggle that we've had. So I appreciate the ideas that people have been trying to come up with about that, and acknowledge that it's just really difficult to create a policy that can accommodate everything. And it's difficult for all of us, I think, that situation.
Thank you. Megan, Scott, Harris, did you have a comment?
Yes, I would say I like your idea, Andy, or some form of it, because I think we do need to address people's current economic activity that's going on with short-term rentals. I mean, we have heard a lot of compelling stories, as Jennifer said, and I think your proposal addresses it, but if it doesn't, we do, I think, need a way to address that. And I don't know what that is exactly, unless some form of grandfathering. But.
Well, here's the thing about my proposal is it would be in the minimum housing code, which is technically not even within the purview of the Planning Commission. So I've put it out there. It's a potential solution. This whole issue is going to be going to the City Council. I don't think we need to resolve it tonight. But when it comes to the City Council and you folks are, and the rest of you on the council are looking at the zoning and the minimum housing code, it's something you could consider then if you want to, or not if you don't want to, but it's an option out there. So all we're doing tonight really, or through our minimum housing code, is putting out a proposal for the council to consider. But again, minimum housing code really isn't within the planning commission purview. We're just trying to set the stage for when this whole package goes to the city council. So I would just say, think about it as this progresses through, but it doesn't look like it's going to make much progress for tonight. But I also think, let me just check, Scott, Megan, it looks like we've gone through the zoning code and the minimum housing code as proposed. Doesn't look like there are any changes being proposed for the minimum housing code for tonight. Is there anything else that we need to do before starting to wrap this up? Do you have any questions left for us that's unanswered in the table or in the code?
Seeing the finish line, Andy.
Okay. I think we're about there. So
I think if the committee is at this stage is satisfied with what is in the two pieces of the ordinances that you have, the zoning, the CDO amendments, and the Chapter 18 amendments. After you take public comment tonight, you could take action to warn a public hearing on the zoning piece of that. We can obviously include the Chapter 18 as part of that hearing if this committee would like. But that would be the next step in the process from a zoning perspective for the committee.
okay. So just before we wrap that piece of it up, at the beginning, I had said there were 4 things that we were looking at that we came up with at our last meeting. One was the concept of splitting it between zoning and minimum housing. We've resolved that one. Second was the zoning code, and we've worked our way through that. Third was the minimum housing code, and I think we've just completed our work on that. And then the fourth one was taking a broader look at it and seeing if there were, we talked about grandfathering, but if there are any exceptions or anything like that that need to be made. Part of my proposal was dealing with that, so I don't know if there's any place for us to go here, but I just wanted to put that back out there because that was the thing we said we would talk about last. Is there any exception or anything else that somebody wants to raise before we close this out? And what I would do once we're done with this, as Megan had suggested, is close out our discussion for now, go to public comments, and then come back to our discussion and wrap up. But anything on any exceptions, or grandfathering is not an option, but anything like that that anybody wants to raise? Okay, I'm not seeing anything. So in the absence of that, I would, unless there's an objection, suspend our comments for right now, whatever you want to call it, and go to public comment, and we could hear from the public and then come back and see if there's a motion to warn for public hearing or anything like that. Sound good to people? Okay, then I'm going to move to hold off, not conclude item 3, but hold off on it and go to item 4, which is a short-term rental public forum. And so now, thank you to everybody who's been watching us and participating in this, for holding off on your comments. And now we'd like to hear from you. So Megan, I'll turn it over to you to hear from folks.
Okay, there were several folks who reached out to me before the meeting, so we'll start there. If you want to speak to the committee on short-term rentals now, you can leave a message in the chat or use the raise hand feature, and we'll get to you after we get to the signups, get through the signups. So the first one is, let's see, McVeigh. I think it was Caitlin McVeigh. Trying to find. Okay, this might be Caitlin. All right, I enabled Kazimak. That's you.
Kathleen.
Thank you. All right, go ahead.
Hi, so I am a tenant who rents an apartment as an Airbnb. I've been doing that since 2018. When I moved to Burlington, I moved here with absolutely no money. I was looking for jobs that would pay and afford like a living wage, and those were impossible to find. I ended up saving money for a year and putting my entire life savings into an apartment with my landlord that he allowed me to Airbnb. And this is my job. This is my livelihood. I don't have any other options right now, especially with COVID. Most of my work experience is in restaurants. So the idea that I'd be losing my job in the middle of a pandemic with no way to feed myself, no way to pay my rent is incredibly scary to me. You know, I'm not wealthy. I'm not a huge home owner in Burlington. I'm just a middle-class person who, with my Airbnb, has been able to live above the poverty line for the first time in my entire life. It's changed my life completely, and losing it would be devastating. Listening to everyone's comments, I'm just unsure why there isn't a way to protect the people who have put a lot of time and energy and money into their Airbnbs while preventing new people from starting Airbnbs. It seems like protecting the people who already have put, you know, their savings into their Airbnbs should be looked at a little bit more, because it would stop the growth of short-term rentals if people who already had them were allowed to keep them while preventing new people from having them. It just seems like a way to curb the rise in short-term rentals without ruining people's lives.
Thank you.
Andy,
Yes, Emily?
just a question. Would this person who lives in the Airbnb be able to continue to Airbnb, because we did isn't it in our language that if it's your own apartment that you would be able to continue to do that?
It's not my own apartment.
Okay, so you
Yeah.
live in one and then you are hosting the other one.
Yes, I used to live in that building, but I've since moved because my roommates moved out and I couldn't have a 3-bedroom without roommates.
Well, thank you for your comments.
Thank you.
Okay, the next one is Aaron Beaudry. Aaron, you should be able to unmute yourself. Okay.
Erin, you're still on mute if you're.
Hi,
Oh, there we go.
thank you guys for letting me. Sorry about that. I'm new to this. So this is not something I've ever done before, but I really feel like I need, because it's between occupied for a few years and have made a very successful business doing so. If not owner
We're not hearing you very well. You keep breaking up.
occupied
Sorry.
short-term rentals, just leaving us. Okay, wrong, but can you hear me now? Anyways, if Burlington eliminates the non-owner occupied short-term rentals, this will put myself and others out of business immediately, leaving us, totally unemployed with no income. I am not, and I'm sure I'm speaking for others, not just myself. I've spoken to several guests and, they have advised me that they would not come to Burlington if they had to stay in places other than a short-term rental. They also don't want to stay in a home, which people's personal belongings being around, obviously, COVID plays a pretty big impact on that. Again, this means a loss of revenue for local businesses, hosts, and of course, us as cleaners. I can understand setting some rules and regulations, but not ones that will put us small business owners out of business. Short-term rentals bring an abundance of revenue to our city and state. I'm asking the city council to please reconsider the elimination of the non-owner occupied short-term rentals for us small businesses in or around the Burlington area. COVID has done enough damage and we really can't add this to it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, the next person is Eric Hanley. Eric, you should be able to unmute.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. You've heard me before. I kind of like Andy's idea on the owner occupied, not having the for the duplexes, you know, not being owner occupied. I still have a hard time why you guys are letting 3 and 4 bedroom place units have not owner occupied and not a duplex with other large people with a 3 and 4 unit place. That I just still have a hard time with. And with the other lady just saying, you know, short-term rentals are here to, you know, that's what these kids want now. That the new generation wants short-term rentals. They don't want to stay in hotels and stuff. And, you know, short-term rentals brings a lot of meals and rooms taxes to the state and to the city too. You know, and it employs a lot of people too. And like I've said before, I have a lady that cleans for me and her 3 kids have college loans, and that's a little extra money to put in their pocket, you know, a couple times a month to help pay their student loans off and stuff. And that's my biggest thing. And you guys talked about it there, and I'm just having a real hard time with, you know, having a duplex that I've owned for over 30 years, and I lived there for 3 or 5 years, you know, like what Andy was trying to propose there. And I think you guys should all really kind of consider what Andy was talking about. And it's, you know, we're in a pandemic too, you know, kicking people out on the curb right now, you know, after they've worked really hard trying to get these businesses up and going, you know, and that we're not all big people, you know, we're all small business people here. So, you know, that's my 2 cents again today. And thank you.
Thank you, Megan.
Okay, next is Deb Lyons. Deb, you should be able to speak.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. I can imagine you are going to not be surprised by what I'm going to say, but I am so disappointed that this committee could not find a balance between supporting small-time landlords alongside the values of supporting tenants in Burlington. I will not rest in speaking out for individual short-term rental hosts who are non-owner occupied, who wish for the chance to rent their property as they wish, which for me means renting both short and long-term to individuals and families from all walks of life. I know this has been a long haul for all of you, but again, I am quite disappointed in how this evening is closing out. For the record, I am so upset I'm coughing up. I can't stand it. I really like Andy's suggestion. This is a great proposal, Andy, and I thank you for that. It is a both and proposal, not either or, which is what's happening right now. I'm going to ask our city councilors to please open your minds to compromise in future discussions on this issue, because sure as hell you are going to be hearing from me. Thank you.
Thank you. Megan?
Okay, next is Julie Marks, who has been asked to read a comment for somebody who couldn't be here. Julie?
Hi, Megan. Thank you. Yeah, I'm not going to speak for myself. I'm just going to read a testimony given to me by Lori Quarterman, who could not be here and attend the meeting tonight. So this is from Lori. As a lifelong resident of Vermont and having grown up in Burlington, this area is near and dear to my heart. My husband and I have had the privilege of being a host with Airbnb in Shelburne since 2013 and have recently moved to Burlington in 2019 after 20 years in Shelburne. My husband and I purchased a property in Burlington from a friend in 2013 with the view to creating an income stream that would help support us in retirement. The property was originally a 3-bedroom home, single family. We had a great young couple in 1 bedroom as primary renters with lots of turnover with roommates as they struggled to pay the rent on the 3-bedroom house. When they moved after 3 years, we got the permits to create a duplex. We now have a couple who has been there for over 4 years in the 2-bedroom, 2-bath original part of the single family home. We have been using this newly created apartment as a short-term rental, with the couple in the front happily supporting us as co-hosts in an area of town that they love, with a yard and off-street parking at below market rate. Prior to using the short-term rental as a 1-bed, 1-bath unit, we were struggling with cash. We have a relatively high debt service and taxes keep going up and up. Being able to host has allowed us to do significant improvements to the property, keep the below market rent for our long-term tenants, and actually have a positive cash flow on the property. We have many guests who repeatedly come back to Burlington in part due to the experience they've had with us and with other local hosts. I could spend hours telling stories of our hosting experience and the warm reputation hosting builds for this wonderful special city and state. I heartily encourage the committee to check out reviews of local hosts on short-term rental platforms to get a sense of why people are craving this type of travel, connection, and accommodation. We are not big investors, but hardworking, self-employed people in the service industry without health insurance, without benefits or a 401k. This has been the solution to many of our financial challenges. Hosting has provided us with so many auxiliary benefits beyond positive cash flow for our rental. For example, flexible work as I care for my aging parents, as well as being able to do volunteer work in the community. Short-term renting has also provided work for my son who has chronic Lyme disease, and he is able to handle the low stress cleaning when guests check out. Another perk, the pleasure of helping guests find the hidden gems in Vermont and creating new friendships in the process. As you can see, I am passionate about hosting. Currently, it looks like this privilege to host will be canceled as we do not live on site. We live 5 minutes away. It feels as though we are being somehow penalized for not being an investor with a larger unit. We feel though we may be forced to sell if this current grid is passed as is. Converting the short term to a long term would not support our debt service. I am not in any way anti-regulation, nor do I get the sense from my fellow hosts. We are very interested in our guest safety and follow the protocols set out on the platforms and Burlington Rental Code. I ask you to consider allowing owners to host off-site if they have a duplex. It is a reasonable request. I have faith that you will act with reasonable integrity and fairness in this matter. And that is from Lori Quarterman.
Okay, thank you.
Next is Eric Morrow.
Hey everyone, can you hear me?
Yes, thanks.
Okay, great. I just want to report in on a DRB review that we had today. I'm also the chair of the DAB. And we had an applicant at 90 Ethan Allen Parkway that had a single family home and was able to change the use of that home to a hotel. So it's a 4-bedroom house that's now a 4-bedroom hotel. And that's existing. That change of use happened in 2020. And today the applicant came forward asking to build an additional to add on to the hotel in the back of their property. And the back of that property, their scheme is 4 separate buildings. So under the definition of a hotel, the way it's being interpreted is that a hotel can be separate buildings and it's really separate cottages. So now there's 4 separate cottages that are moving successfully through DAB onto DRB. So as chair of DAB, just some clarification around what a hotel is intended to be, whether it's supposed to be a single building or if it's really allowed to be separate buildings. It's kind of unclear in the definition. So some clarity in that definition would go a long way. It currently says it should be a 3-room building. So I don't know how it got through today, but we could see more of that. Single family homes changing use to hotels in districts where that's permitted, and then building more cottages in the back. So that's one thing. And my last point is that I hear the idea of a 3-year look back if you own a property for 3 years. I guess, kind of my thought is that just every opportunity that we have should be an equal opportunity. And I think of somebody who's wanting to buy a home that is now disadvantaged by people who own homes. Or another way to say it is that a concentration of opportunity is really a concentration, is followed by a concentration of wealth. That the people who have property are then entitled or able to generate more wealth. I think new home buyers should also be considered equally, and that everybody should be considered equally when something becomes available. That's all I have. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Megan?
Okay, next is Jamie Sharp, and I'm not sure if this is Jamie or Ellis.
Hi, this is Ellis.
Okay.
I want to reiterate Deb's comments. I think tonight's tone and tenor has been extremely disheartening, to say the least. It just makes absolutely zero rational sense to allow non-owner occupied for triplex and quadplex, but to say you have to be owner occupied for a single family or a duplex. I mean, this is about the art of compromise, and you've heard us plead for a year. Okay, we've been coming to these meetings diligently, and we've suffered great emotional distress. And the fact that council members and committee members alike refuse to budge, and in the process are going to absolutely destroy people's livelihoods and ability to afford property in Burlington, it's shameful. I find it utterly disgusting. And, not to be personal here, but I do, I have to mention Zariah. I'm sorry. I have to.
I'm going to cut you off right there. When you talk, you could address either all of us or you address the chair, but please don't call out any individuals on here. That's just not the appropriate thing to do on our committee.
Excuse me. I don't need you to say thank you, Andy. Okay. This is my floor. I am offended greatly when people on this committee keep talking about tax, more tax. Let's go after the landlords and let's place them all in the same bucket. Let's place all of the landlords who are struggling to survive in the same bucket as the Bissonnettes, as the Handies, whoever you want to call it. We don't have 500 properties. So to say, let's incentivize behavior with taxing, more taxing, and more taxing, I find it offensive. And this needs to change. I mean, it's utterly offensive.
And I just want to add, this is Jamie. I'm not going to point anyone out, but there are people on this panel that have Airbnbs. And what I'm finding from page 16 that you guys are all agreeing to is their circumstances fall perfectly into this. And I just don't see how that is appropriate, that you've considered people's own personal situations here that are on the committee, but you have not listened to us that have been talking to you for over a year. And then the other point I want to make is you're not just hurting the hosts and the people that many of you tonight said you don't feel sorry for, you're not sympathetic to. Some of you have, but you guys said, a few of you, I won't call you out, have said, I'm not sympathetic to their situation tonight. But what you're doing is you're cutting off tourism to Burlington. Think about many of you, I'm sure, use short-term rentals when you go to other places, and people, and mostly the younger generation as well, only stay in short-term rentals. So they're not going to be coming to Burlington. They're not going to be coming to the local businesses and restaurants that are already struggling drastically this year. So you guys need to think about the bigger picture of what you're doing to tourism in Burlington. And the smirks on some of your faces when we're talking is really, really disheartening. Thank you.
Thank you. Megan?
Okay, the next person is Chris Hasley.
Hey, can you all hear me?
Yes.
First of all, I just want to thank everyone for participating in this. I know this has been a long and arduous slog for most of us, both those of us in the short-term rental community, and for those of you that are trying to struggle, and put some kind of workable policy together here. They say that there's two sides to every argument, but I think in this one, there's multiple sides. I'd like to hopefully present a perspective that has not really been heard here, other than some of the speakers earlier tonight, in that I'm a renter, that I'm a host. And my concern is that as I understand the proposal to be, I would not be allowed to continue to operate as a host simply because my residence is in a building that has more than 5 units. And I think that that's an issue for folks that are renters because it kind of excludes us from participating in the short-term rental market.
Chris, I don't mean to interrupt you, but what you're saying, Megan, is what he's saying correct? Or is that incorrect? You're on mute.
Sorry. I think I would need to hear the circumstance again, just to make sure that.
Chris, would you just describe your circumstance? I just want to make sure that you're speaking correctly.
So that we can all be on the same page, literally. Page 16 of the agenda. And this just kind of came to me as I was listening to the meeting here. That folks that live in a multi-unit building with more than 5 units would not be, I think it says no STRs allowed. And perhaps I'm misunderstanding or misreading the proposal here. But I guess what I'm saying is that if you're a renter and a tenant and you have the ability to, the consent of your property owner to participate in the short-term rental market, it seems that those of us, would be precluded from doing that just because we live in a building with 10 units or whatever.
Is the unit, Chris, that you rent as a short-term rental, is it the same one that you live in?
Part-time.
Yes, then you would be permitted to do that. The committee did create a carve out that says that a host is allowed to short-term rent the dwelling unit they live in, and it's not subject to any of the other limits in the table.
Okay, thank you for clarifying on that. The point I was gonna say is that there's other folks that are also hosts here as well. And I think some of them do have standalone units. Most of them are self-employed and away for a home for several days, if not weeks at a time, and they sometimes participate in the market. And I guess what I'm not understanding is why there's a cutoff, if you're going to allow a multi-unit building with 3 or 4, why 5 is the magic number here, and that perhaps maybe a percentage or a cap on that would be reasonable. Certainly, we don't want it to be a free-for-all, but I think that that's something that I'd like to see the committee take another look at. I think, about the new Cambrian Rise development, as I understand it, there are several buildings with upwards of 50 individual units. So a couple scenarios that come to mind. Imagine a college student who wishes to study abroad for a semester and would like to rent out their apartment while they're away. It may be that they really like their apartment and they've secured an affordable long-term lease, which they're not willing to give up. Or maybe they don't want to be hassled with looking for a new place to live when they return from their study abroad. Or maybe they work in the nonprofit sector and they spend part of the year in Africa or Central America, which is the case with one of my neighbors. Regardless of the reason, I think renters should also be able to serve as Airbnb hosts, provided that they are not prohibited from doing so under the terms of their lease. I think in a broader sense, again, this is a very complex issue and it's hard to come to a consensus on this, but I do think that those folks that have spoke against the the residency requirement, I'm inclined to agree with that. But I also understand the city has a very real, very compelling reason to preserve the housing stock here, and we can't have it be a free-for-all where everyone's going out. So I guess my thought on this would be, what in my view is a kind of a middle ground, is to say, look, you get to rent out your primary residence, where you live, and you get to rent out maybe like 1 other unit or 2 other units, whatever the appropriate magic number happens to be, and that's it. Because I think clearly what we don't want is people building out entire portfolios of short-term rentals, which in my view is in fact contributing to the issue that the city is trying to address. But at the same time, I think we need to try to find a balance to recognize that there are some people that have made investments in property here in Burlington that may not live within city limits, and they may no longer live in the city anymore, even though they may have previously, as we've heard from some of the other speakers. I think that they should not be precluded from this, but I don't think we want, again, to be a big free-for-all where we're getting, people building out a portfolio of 7, 8, or 9 short-term rentals. I think, allowing your primary residence and then maybe 1 or 2 other units would provide a degree of flexibility and would also contribute to the housing costs, as several folks have mentioned, with respect to incorporating a short-term rental into a larger mix with long-term rentals and losing the increased income from the short-term rental to help subsidize and keep the rents affordable for other folks. So I'm kind of feeling like, we're kind of hearing, from one end, and then we're hearing from the other end. It's kind of like black or white. And I'm kind of saying, hey, maybe there's some gray in the middle and we can find a middle ground here while, putting some reasonable limits in place to prevent the conversion of long-term housing stock to short-term rental, but also at the same time provide a degree of flexibility for the people who do currently participate. I would also like to say that, we are also in the middle of a pandemic here. And certainly I think that bears mentioning with respect to the current regulations. As I understand it, lodging establishments in general, including short-term rentals, there's a requirement on the books that, you can't intermingle households. So I guess under that stipulation, I'm not sure how someone could be renting out rooms in their individual home without being in violation of that provision. Now, I wasn't entirely clear about that, so I actually reached out to the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, and they did in fact state that that was the case. And I know of at least one individual that is doing that, and I'm just kind of thinking that, with a health and safety issue going on, we should probably give that a fair hearing as well. So I'm hopeful that maybe there'll be a middle ground here that we can find to preserve the rights of people who may not live on site, but also at the same time reasonably protect what's going on with the housing supply here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Andy, that is all the hands I see. If anyone else put your name in the chat, I apologize. There's been a lot of comments, so maybe just stick it in there again. Oh, sorry, a couple more people have raised their hands. Sharon Busher, you should be able to talk.
Hi, thank you. I'm sorry, I didn't email you. I told Scott, and I apologize. I did not do it the correct way. I wanted to sort of say yay that you're coming to the end of this process, but I feel that you are all, everyone's so conflicted. The people who have followed this process throughout, those who have been involved and stepped away like me, and all of you who have stayed with it. I think the issues have been incredibly difficult, and I'm very sad that the legal opinion for grandfathering or just allowing what currently happens in Burlington, to have a deadline for people to let you know what they're doing and then to allow that and discontinue it if it stops. I think that's really unfortunate, because I feel like a lot of this happened before we really had a regulation in place. And I feel for those people. I know some of these people, a lot of people I don't know, but I agonize over their situations because when you live close to the edge financially, and I'm not saying all of these people do, it's and this is your livelihood. I just can't even imagine what it would be like to have the rug pulled out. I live close to the edge. I don't have a short-term rental as part of my income, but if I did, I would be devastated. And so I'm really struggling with what I hear, and yet I understand, as all of you do, the need to have regulations, and I do believe that I want to protect the housing stock. I want to protect long-term renters. I want to protect single-family homes and let them get sold to other families or other individuals that would stay in the neighborhood and give some stability to our neighborhoods and our cities. So this is just part of the puzzle. When I looked at the chart, there was just one thing that one of the speakers before me mentioned, which I don't recall. I tried to find out why you came down on this way, but I don't recall. When you have a unit that is 5 or more, when you have a building that has 5 or more units, why you decided no short-term rental would be allowed? I know there was initially, Councilor Hightower had proposed making sure that it never exceeded 50%. And so there was a proposal that you couldn't have any more than 3 units or something like that. But then I don't remember why you went to no units. And I still feel that I'm not sure in my opinion, I feel like I really wish that would be looked at again, because to me, one unit would be consistent. I don't know why that particular entity has to be devoid of short-term rentals. It doesn't make any sense at all to me. And what I saw on the ground when I was out there doing my census work was structures that had a lot of units in them, that had a lot of people that used them as second homes, and there were a lot of short-term rental units in those properties. And so I just don't know how this is all going to fit together if you are that restrictive. So that's my comment. Thank you so much for all your work. And I hope the City Council will define the process that is next steps. So if the public knows whether you as an ordinance committee will take this up and once again go through this, or whether it will be a shorter timeline since you've spent a year collectively doing this. I think it's really important for people to know next steps in the process after the Planning Commission has their public hearings. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. And the last person I see is Lucas Jensen. Lucas, you should be able to unmute.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, thank you. I just wanted to take a quick minute to make sure that everyone on the committee is aware of the report which we sent you. It came in a little bit later than your deadline, Megan. But this report is, I think, a very worthwhile read for all of you to understand a little bit more about the role that short-term rentals play in affordable housing. This is a recently published report that was based on an analysis of a significant amount of data. In fact, they looked at every single county in the entire United States over a period of 4 years from 2014 to 2018. And this report was completed by a group from Oxford University. So it's a reputable group. They looked at a ton of data. And some of their findings in that is that the rapid U.S. house price and rent increases over the past few years have not been substantially driven by short-term rentals. They also state as a conclusion that adopting strict regulations on short-term rentals is unlikely to solve the housing affordability crisis faced by many U.S. households. They point to issues around new housing supply and new construction permits as having a greater impact on housing affordability than the role that short-term rentals play. There is an executive summary that's included in that. It would take you a few minutes just to look through it, but I encourage all of you to do that. Basically, I mean, this report really suggests that the genesis of this committee is based on a false assumption that short-term rentals are causing issues in housing affordability in the city of Burlington. This study says quite clearly that it is not. I just wanted to also take this time to respond to a few comments that were made tonight, just in general. There was a comment about the partying that goes on in short-term rentals. And I just want to say that long-term renters have parties too. I don't think that that's specific to short-term rentals. In fact, a unit that I own, the long-term renters that are next door to this unit have had significant more issues with partying than anything that has ever happened in the short-term rental unit that we have. There was also a comment made about major landlords converting units to short-term rentals. And I just want to make sure everyone understands here that running a short-term rental is not something that you do on a whim. It's not an easy thing to do. It takes a lot of effort. It takes a long time to develop. It takes a lot of money to put that in place. So it's not something that you can just choose to do overnight or take back after. I mean, you literally have to buy enough furniture to furnish a complete house. And the success of a short-term rental is based on the attractiveness of that unit, as well as the evaluations of people who have stayed there. So it's not like, it's just something that you kind of come up with. there was a suggestion again about taxing, and I don't want you guys to lose the fact that the reason why a lot of us are participating in the short-term rental market is because the taxes are so high already. So to suggest that there should be more taxes placed on us is just very hard for me to understand that. The reason why many of us participate in the short-term rental market is because without that excess income that those have generated, it would be very hard for us to continue to own our homes and improve them and invest in them as they need. The last thing I just want to mention as well, there was the chair had asked for comments about other things that are in the ordinance. There was no one raised any issues. I did want to raise one, which it's my understanding in the ordinance as it written is that no inspections would be required in the partial unit short-term rentals in an owner-occupied situation, which I have an issue with because I think that safety is of paramount importance when it comes to these things, that when you are running a short-term rental, you are inviting the public into your home, and it's critical that that's a safe place for them to be. And I don't think because you are an owner occupant that you shouldn't have to adhere to those same regulations that someone as a non-owner occupant would be. Those are my comments for this evening. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Megan, is there anyone else?
Yes, I see another one. Abbott Stark.
What?
Abbott, you should be able to speak.
Thanks, Megan. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Thanks, everybody. I appreciate the opportunity to speak, and I did think Andy's suggestion of the 90 or of the 3-year residency or ownership requirement before short-term rentals would address a lot of the problems that the committee's heard. I do want to say that I've heard, especially from a couple of the city councilors and one of the panel members, that there is a lot of tension between the those in our community who have something. In this case, I think we're talking about a lot of really small time landlords who may have like one house or be renting a second apartment, and the have-nots in our community, and those would be the people who need affordable housing. I had some other testimony prepared, but I do commend, I do commend focusing on affordable housing. I think that's important. I think that as members of the Planning and Zoning Committee, there are actually some bigger targets. If you want to take a bolder action that might actually address creating more units in our city or allowing more units to be created, and would relieve some of the tension on the economy that way. The report that Lucas just mentioned, I just thought there was a portion of it. I don't know if anybody did get to read it because it came out pretty recently, but the aim of this study, I'm just going to quote it now, was to assess the contribution of STR growth on the growth in house price, rental price, and affordability. We have found that the rapid US house price and rent increases of the past few years have not been substantially driven by STRs. We estimate the growth in STR density only contributed to 0.2 percentage points of the 4.3% increase in rents and 1.0 percentage point of the 14.9% increase in house prices over the study period. This compares to a 3.9% points impact of median incomes to rental growth and 6.8 percentage points effect on house price growth stemming from the drop in US unemployment over the study period. This has important implications for a policy debate that has focused heavily on short-term rentals as both the cause of the problem of high house prices and its solution. It suggests instead that the major sources of volatility in rental and house prices lie in economic and labor market outcomes. Second, this study has found that additional housing supply and more abundant building permits are likely to have a meaningful impact on house prices. It is estimated that in the long run, a 10% increase in the housing units to household ratio is associated with approximately 18.9% fall in the house price index, and a 1 unit increase in the number of building permits per household is associated with a 6.9% fall in the house price index. Finally, our analysis has pointed to the fact that adopting strict regulations on STRs is unlikely to solve the housing affordability crisis faced by many US households. During the period 2014 to 18, in the absence of STR growth, real rent would have grown by 4.1% rather than 4.3%. In other words, monthly rents would have been $2 lower in 2018 if STRs had not increased from their 2014 levels. So I just wanted to take, in closing, now this is me talking again, I just wanted to take some of the heat off of this conversation tonight and this vote. I do think it has gotten really emotional on all sides, and I think we're sort of we're fighting for scraps here, proverbial scraps of a very small piece of the housing pie, the income pie in our area. This isn't, there's no data to support making any of this regulation on STRs more stringent is going to do anything to help low-income people afford housing in Burlington. I just put a Washington Post article into the chat that I would suggest, especially those of you who are passionate about providing low-income housing, to read and seriously consider, because I do think that you are in a position of power. We have elected you, we have chosen you to, based on your platform of looking out for these folks who need some economic support and lower rents. There are tools that you can use in the zoning toolbox to achieve those outcomes. And as a pretty progressive person, and a member of this community who cares about its lower income residents, I would encourage you to take some bold actions. But STR regulation is not going to get you there. Take a look at the Oxford Economics report if there's any question about that, but don't put so much pressure on yourselves and on this vote tonight to be a panacea for treating the larger problems of inequity and income distribution that face our community. So with that, thank you. And thanks for all your work on this issue. Have a good night.
Hey, thank you. So is that it?
Yes, I think so.
Okay, so I'm going to bring us back to item 3, which is again the short-term rentals proposed amendment. We've gone through the zoning code and we've gone through the minimum housing code. Are there any further comments, questions, changes, anything, or are we ready for a motion to move towards a public hearing? Emily.
I had a question. Could Megan or staff speak to what kind of flexibility we have in how long of a transition period hosts could have? Like, can we take a year or more before this starts to be enforced in order to give people, plenty of transition time?
The short answer is yes, we've talked about a year, but you guys can decide that. It could be 6 months, it could be 2 years, right? Or a year. So yeah, there's flexibility for a longer period.
Is that something that we would talk about on this committee, or does that happen in staff and administration?
I think you could weigh in with the recommendation. Ultimately, it would be up to the council upon adoption, I think.
Right. This is one that's city council. The minimum housing code is for city council, so we could certainly give our input on it. But
sure, I guess I'd say we should vote on this and maybe have a recommendation about, personally having a very long time period for people to be able to transition, from short-term rentals to something else. And I would look at to something that's a year or more.
Anyone else?
I just had a question about the idea that we're going to be, putting people out of a house or a job during a pandemic. What is the earliest this could become regulation? We warn for a public hearing, right? Like, just play out that timeline really quick.
So, we usually talk in zoning ordinance timelines, but I would say that, depending on how quickly this moves through city council discussion, we're still looking at a couple of months before a zoning ordinance would be adopted at this stage with all of the public hearing requirements that are involved. That said, I can't speak to, where the council agendas sit right now and when this is likely to be taken up by the council. But I think to the question that Emily just asked, the council can include direction on when we would actually start enforcing this and set a timeline for that may be different from the actual time of adoption of the ordinances.
Okay. Anyone else? Do we have a motion to go towards public hearing? Or do you want to defer taking that action? Not seeing anyone who wants to weigh in.
Public hearing doesn't obligate you to do anything with this. It just, signals that you would like to continue moving the process of considering this forward. After you hold a public hearing, unlike the public hearings that happen on zoning amendments at the council level, the committee can still make tweaks to what's proposed here before and have additional conversation about it if you would like, before you refer it to the city council or do nothing with it. So warning it for a public hearing does not obligate you to ultimately do anything with it after that.
So I think we could either warn it for public hearing tonight or just defer action until our next meeting.
And are we warning both the zoning language and the minimum housing, or we get to decide whether those are both part of the public hearing? Is that what I heard you say earlier?
Technically, the Planning Commission only has the authority to warn a public hearing on the zoning piece, which are the pieces that are most straightforward as part of all of this. I think staff's recommendation would be that you, even though you wouldn't formally hold a hearing on both pieces, that you accept comments on the Chapter 18 parts of it at your public hearing, because I think a lot of people will be interested in those elements of this ordinance structure, and I'm sure you're likely to hear them anyways.
So
the intent is to keep them together so that they move forward.
Okay, so I move that we warn a public hearing on the zoning amendments as proposed, and also that we take comment on the minimum housing changes. And is there anything else I need to include in that?
Do we need the memo included?
And the memo, sorry, including the memo.
And your memo does specify which pieces of this structure are in zoning and which are in Chapter 8.
Do we have a motion by Jennifer? Is there a second?
I'm good.
Seconded by Emily. Any further discussion on this? Harris?
Yeah, I'm going to support the motion just because I do want to move this process forward. It's taken us this long. I'm not totally comfortable with it, but I know this is just warning a public hearing, so I do want to get to that stage. And I just, we've heard such strong comments tonight and through this whole process. I think we'll have failed if we don't somehow address these people who are just trying to get along here in town, and then that livelihood's going to be potentially taken away from them. So I still think either we or the city council has to work that in somehow. But and I also just want to say that I have heard in a lot of the comments I personally don't think short-term rentals are a problem, notwithstanding Emily's, comment about the house near her being a party house or having had that problem. But I think that's more the exception than the rule with short-term rentals. I think they do add positively to the community, except for the fact that they take away from the housing stock. I do see that as an issue. So I'm glad we're addressing that. And it does seem like we're focusing inordinately on this one single issue, but I would just encourage participants to look at the other work that the planning commission has done outside of short-term rentals. For whatever reason, this has taken us really long, but this isn't the only thing we've been focusing on.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions, comments before we go to a vote? All right, seeing none, all those in favor of the motion to warn for public hearing and public comment, please say aye or raise your hand.
Aye.
Any opposed? Don't see any opposed, so it looks like that's unanimous. So that, thank you. So that closes out this item for now, and will come back to us in a month or so, Emily, for public hearing.
Yes, it'll be about a month. Yeah.
Okay, great. So again, that closes out item 3, at least for tonight, and we've done item 4. So item 5 is commissioner items. Our next meeting is March 23rd and April 13th after that. Any other comments, Emily?
I did want to amplify what Eric brought up earlier, because I was aware of that DAB and got a chance to look at it. And it was the first time I ever looked at what the definition of a hotel is. And it's pretty broad. It seems like a hotel is allowed in the zone. My understanding was there wasn't a lot of restrictions on what really classified something as a hotel. So since it feels like there's going to maybe in the zones where hotels are allowed, there'll probably be a lot of traffic as people who are doing Airbnb now, go through the process of changing their use to a hotel. I think it would be prudent to review what do we think a hotel is, and is that what a hotel really is in the code?
Thanks. Any other commissioner items? Bruce?
I just want to, one of the speakers talked about other items in our zoning code that may prevent supply and impact the housing stock. And I think there are quite a few. And I just want, and that's why this one is sort of difficult to spend this much time on. And I'll just mention 2. Historic building material, historic additions to historic buildings. Every time an applicant applies for an addition to a historic building, they're required to defer to the existing structure, which means it's got to be smaller in the back. So if it's 2-story, it's got to be 1. If it's, and units are lost in precious circumstances. We have very little infill left, and they're being lost every day. And I think that's one area where we could provide a better balance. Another one is housing in the South End. Our South End plan doesn't allow for housing. That's really difficult in the context of the kinds of things we're doing right now, where we're sort of really impacting these folks that we're talking about with short-term rentals, yet we're ignoring these major glacial issues that are out there.
Okay, thanks. Anyone else? All right, I'll close out item 5. We're on to item 6, which are minutes and communications. Is there a motion to approve the minutes and accept communications?
Motion to
by
accept the
Alex.
minutes and communications and approve them.
Thank you. Is there a second? Seconded by Harris. Any discussion? All those in favor, raise your hand or say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? We have our minutes and communications, and item 7 is adjournment. Motion to adjourn
Moved
by Harris, seconded by Emily. All those in favor of adjournment, say aye. Aye. We stand adjourned. Thank you all. This has been a long haul. We still have a little bit more to go with the public hearing coming up in a month or so, and then, see where things go after that. But thanks to everybody for your patience and your hard work on this one. So.